Get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Call, and I'm with the Travel and Tourism Research Association. TTRA unites the best and brightest in the travel and tourism industry, and we are so happy to have you all here with us today. Today, we welcome Ethan Chernofsky, Senior VP of Marketing at Placer.ai, who will be discussing the evolving U.S. traveler, sharing insights into lodging, mobility, and tourism trends. I hope you all enjoy today's webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. And now I'll pass this off to Ethan.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm really excited to be here. We're going to do a quick introduction to what Placer is, what informs the data and the perspectives that we bring to the table. Then we'll dive into the presentation. Then, as always, we'll make sure there's time for questions. And so please keep those coming in. It's always fun to have this conversation live. So what is Placer? What is the data that kind of informs our perspective? Placer is a location analytics company. What that means in the very simplest form, people vote with their feet. We show you how they vote across the United States every single day. We do that by observing a panel of tens of millions of mobile devices. Very critically, this is all aggregate data that has been stripped of identifiers like MAIDs. So we are CCPA compliant, GDPR compliant, etc. So we analyze that data with AI and machine learning algorithms and utilize that to make estimations on visits to retail locations across the country. And then we display that in a wealth of different reports within our platform on everything from the customer journey, cross-visitation, visit trends, and a whole lot more. And with that, I think we could dive into the content.
What is the current state of domestic tourism in the U.S.?
So I think when we think about domestic tourism, what's really fascinating is there's been some really significant changes in how we've operated across our normal daily lives in everything from our professional patterns, our migration patterns, and our kind of retail patterns that have given us this really interesting indication as to what is happening across the country. So when we look at domestic tourism, travel, etc., we do see continued strength. Now, obviously, when we think excuse me, about that peak that was taking place post-pandemic, where people could move around the country, but they couldn't necessarily leave the country yet. That hasn't sustained because that was just kind of all of this demand had to go somewhere. It was going here, but we are still seeing a great degree of strength. And I think what's really interesting is understanding that these patterns are changing. They're changing quite rapidly, and they're giving us indications that there are opportunities to create more demand for domestic tourism because of the context. And so there is a greater degree of control than we may have had before, a greater understanding of how we can deal with cycles, how we can deal with some of the patterns of travel that could create more demand, more excitement, and a more readiness for that domestic traveler to reach these other areas of the country.
What trends can be seen when looking at some of the top performers in tourism growth?
So I think what's interesting is we look at these hotspots. There are a few things that kind of align them. And obviously here we're looking at Q4 2024, so that last 3 months of last year compared to the year prior, and where you see the biggest amount of growth and the most excitement, and shockingly in the winter in the United States, is in places that are warmer. So you see that kind of southeast from like Texas through Florida having a tremendous amount of success. And this gives us this kind of classic thing that I don't think anyone who works in the tourism industry is going to be shocked to hear, but weather and that seasonal push to go somewhere warm when it's cold can have a real pull. Now, obviously, the reverse can also be true, but in broad strokes, these places are going to do better when the offering is counter to what you're getting at home. There's also something that we're seeing that's been really interesting in the sense that cities that have this level of authenticity are seeing peaks. So I would put Charleston in this category. I would put New Orleans in this category. I would put Austin in this category. It's places that have a very clear offering and a very clear sense of who they are and what you're getting when you travel to these areas. And I think this concept of uniqueness and authenticity is super significant because a lot of travelers are looking for something that resonates. And when we think about the wider trend that we're seeing from consumers broadly, it's this chase of authenticity, of like what is real, what is exciting, what is not just kind of standard. And I think when we think about travel very often, a lot of cities, their success comes when they're very true to themselves and they really understand how do we identify, embrace our unique selling point and live it to its fullest extent. Now, obviously, Things like being a conference hotspot can help, and not to minimize any of those elements. But there is this piece of when you can have that success, when it is this real reason for being, that longevity, the word of mouth marketing, the excitement that is generated often increases. And the last bit is obviously travel ease. So, places where you can get to fairly easily, there's lots of flights going in. I think Charleston's actually one of the outliers here when we think about, Atlanta is obviously an easier city to go to because it's a hub for so many places. So is Miami. But some of these other cities are a little bit more challenging, yet they're able to rate, even though there are some challenges getting to them, where it's not the simplest trip that you might take. And I think that can obviously play a significant role.
And then real quick, I missed a question from Jacob earlier, asking where the data is coming from, like if it's a Zira or something else.
So
Uh,
all of the data is ours. This is Placer data. So one of the things that kind of sets our data set apart is um, one, the sources that will provide us with data. So the companies that are willing to partner with us because of the way we approach privacy is more robust and gives us access to different data sources. So lots of players in the space were kind of, built pre-GDPR and had approaches where they were oriented towards advertising or really focused on PII or individual user data. We were kind of a post-GDPR company, so privacy was always built into our perspective. We don't have PII in our system. I can't tell you about individuals. You can't target individuals. It is this kind of macro trends platform, understanding how people are moving and what that could mean. And that's given us access to better data sets, but it is all ours. We don't source out our data to other people. We kind of grow the vegetables, cook the meals ourselves. Listen, I kind of, that was the first time I've used that, and I feel like it worked. If it didn't work, someone comment, and I'll try to find a better one. But I feel like I'm a little excited about that one.
that was perfect. Thank you. And then how should we understand the impact of hybrid work on tourism behavior and potential?
Yeah, so this is one of my favorite topics. I've talked about this like ad nauseum in retail forums, in forums about real estate, and I haven't had the chance yet to do it in a tourism orientation. So it's actually really exciting because one of the points that I make that's often a throwaway now gets to be the emphasis. The the two biggest things when we think about the legacy of the pandemic from actual tangible results, we're going to look back at two things that were really significant, I think. The first is the rise and sustainability of hybrid work. Now, critically, when we say hybrid work, I'm not talking about people never going into the office again, as we were saying they were going to in the midst of the pandemic. It's this idea I go in 2, 3, 4 days a week. And the second piece, and it's almost an offshoot of that, is shifts in migration patterns. So if you look at major cities across the country, there was this exodus of specific audiences to the suburbs. Now, that doesn't mean that cities were left empty. No, other audiences came in and took up those spots. But there was this move. And the move was largely generated by the idea that I don't need to go to the office every day. And if I don't have to go in 5 days a week, I only have to go in three. I'm willing to live a little further out and sacrifice on the commute a little bit more because it's less time overall, right? I can find this balance. So if we take those things to be true, the interesting thing is what those mean for the consumer. So on the one hand, if I'm moving from city to suburb, a place of a higher cost of living to a place of lower cost of living, a place where I'm likely living in a smaller place to a larger space, my consumption patterns change, and they change pretty fundamentally. Like I have more space to fill. My patterns are going to be different. The places I'm going to frequent on a regular basis are going to be different. The things I'm going to be exposed to on a day to day are going to be pretty different. But there is this potential that I have more disposable income than I did before. Really important, really interesting. Oh, by the way, also lack of city fix, also important piece here. The second element is if I don't go into the office every day, when do I go to the office? And what we saw, one of the things that really popped, and we're seeing a slight rebound in it, is when we look at the proportion of visits during the week today compared to the pre-pandemic and how they've rested out since 2019, the days that were the most punished, so to speak, from hybrid work were Mondays and Fridays. Very, very critically, Mondays is starting to rise back. Like it is interesting seeing how it's starting to like have this comeback. But overall, still, middle of the week is getting a much larger proportion of visits than it did pre-pandemic. And Mondays and Fridays are the days where people are saying, that's the day I'm going to choose to not come into the office. And the really interesting thing about the placement of those days is they enable a different mode that we weren't really used to from a consumer perspective. So we classically think about people from like weekend, weekday. Weekend, I do what I want. I spend time with my family. I go, I consume, I do entertainment. I go to the grocery store. I do all the things I need to do, right? Weekday, I go to work. I schlep in the morning. I do my hour-long commute. I work at the office. I pack up. I go back, and it's like this rushed existence. Like it really changes my patterns. If I have Monday and Friday, what that does is it creates this buffer period where essentially now we have three modes. Mode one is weekend. Mode two is weekday from work, and mode three is weekday from home. And weekday from home is critical for a few reasons. One, it allows some of the things that we need to do, some of those like jobs, going to the grocery store, that I have to do at, I don't know, on the weekends. I can now do it 8 a.m. on a Monday morning because I don't need to go into the office that day. So I'm not losing any work time. So that's one thing. I've freed up more time on my weekend. I've also given myself this buffer of like, look, we found this really cute Airbnb in Charleston. Me and my wife want to go away for a long weekend. We can leave Thursday night, get there Friday, stay through Sunday night, and get home Monday morning and not miss a minute of work, but get to experience this thing and maybe do a little bit of work from that place because it's one house versus another. I'm already not going into the office. And so this creates these really interesting opportunities for like adjacent places. So if I'm like thinking about like, I'm an East Coast boy, like I that's always where my orientation starts. But if I'm thinking about like the Catskills in New York, this like beautiful area, the Hudson Valley, like all these places that can pull someone from the city for this long weekend perspective, that opportunity should be heightened now because it's not far enough away that it's so far, and it's close enough that it can, in theory, create that pull for that extended weekend. And so all of these changes, they are significant. They don't have to be enormous in terms of a data perspective to be significant. And what they offer is both challenges to certain environments, but opportunities in others. And from a tourism perspective, there is a powerful opportunity here.
Where is the consumer at from a value orientation perspective? Like, what is driving consumer behavior in retail?
So I think this is really important. And one of the things that triggered this for me was I was doing an analysis of I was just looking at other sources for what was going on in the tourism space more broadly. And one of the things that it was talking about was during the peak of inflation, domestic tourism was seen as was seeing a rise, or at least this one analyst group was saying that, was seeing a rise when you compared it to international tourism because people were looking to save money and it was just a little bit cheaper to do so within the United States. No, I think when we think about that, we're looking for like what are the indications of where the consumer mindset is at. And so one of the things that we found that's really interesting is very often when we want to understand where consumers' heads are at, whatever our purpose might be, trying to generate tourism, trying to understand a whole range of different patterns, we look at the things that they're doing day to day and how those changes are, how those patterns are shifting. And so one of the areas that we looked at is what types of retail do they visit? Do they visit ones more oriented towards value or ones maybe more oriented towards luxury? And we see a clear shift to value, right? So that's one thing that tells us a lot about the consumer. The consumer is in this mindset of like, if I can save, I want to save, where do I try to save? Now that could mean more to then spend on travel or something they consider big ticket and significant. But it could also mean that there's going to be audiences, especially we consider all of the wider economic trends that we've seen over the last few years, what we've seen over the last few months, that this opportunity to speak in value terminology really resonates with the consumer right now. The second element is that they're very oriented towards experience. They want to have something that is interesting, that is exciting, that is engaging, that is about them, and that this kind of this cookie cutter experience is resonating less at the when what is rising this idea of authenticity, something unique, something different, something that really speaks. And that's the brands we care about, the places we're willing to stay, the places we look to travel, etc. The next element, though, and I think this is really important, is that people are willing to do more for things that they love at the expense of things that we've classically considered to be very, very important. So let me give you an example. Traditionally, or is the very traditionally, at the beginning of this decade, there was an article in Forbes, and it came out and said, in the post-pandemic era, convenience is king, right? Which would mean convenience is the most important thing, which would mean that convenience creates very significant barriers. So if my retail location is not convenient, you're not going to go to it. You're going to go to the place that's more. If my destination is not convenient enough, you're not going to go there. What we've seen though is while convenience is clearly important, it is very, very much exaggerated. And the thing that drives people to overcome convenience is something unique, different, something that they really resonate with. And it goes back to in almost every area we look at of consumer behavior, whether it's their social media consumption, whether it's the way that they move into the physical world, whether it's the things that they look for in travel, that pursuit of authenticity, that pursuit of what is unique and what speaks to me, the brand value of a place is so significant now and probably more significant than it's ever been. And part of that is because so much of the convenience layer has been equalized. Now, obviously, when we're thinking about places, if you are closer to an airport versus further away from an airport, if your airport has more flights, that's going to be significant. But again, many consumers are willing to do that extra leg of the flight in order to get to the place that is considered to have that extra value. So leaning into what it is that sets you apart, what it is that makes that place special becomes all the more important in this environment because it tells the consumer this is what you're looking for. This is the thing that rises above those thresholds that you would have for when is the visit worthwhile.
How did the shift in migration patterns that were triggered by the pandemic change the way regions should think about tourism opportunities?
So I think there's a couple of things here that are really significant. So one, when we think about migration patterns, there was this kind of initial discussion in that pandemic environment of like, oh my God, everyone has left New York, Chicago, San Francisco. No one is ever going back. Everyone is now in Tampa Bay, Austin, and Phoenix. And apparently the entire US population is going to live in those three cities. Now, that clearly wasn't true. Like it was massively exaggerated. But one of the things that's interesting is when you're looking at this chart, you're seeing all of the, if you take only net positive migration, where did the bulk of that happen? Now, the big bulk was in South Florida and Texas. Those were like the two clear winners, so to speak, of driving domestic migration or air shifts in migration patterns increases. Now, there's really interesting elements here. Let's think about it from a practical sense. Audiences that went from New York, like most migration is within the state. Most of the migration that we saw now, except for areas like New York, where it could be from New York to New Jersey, New York to Connecticut, etc., most migration is within the state. Why? Because the cost of moving from one state to another outpaces, at least at the time of the pandemic, the annual savings of most families that live within those states. So people simply can't afford to move that far. But we did see a lot of movement, and that movement, again, small but significant changes. You have audiences that are moving from places like New York, places like San Francisco, places like Chicago, to places like Texas and Florida, which one of the big things that those two places have in common is you don't have the same taxation there. So you potentially have a more disposable income. You're going from places from where things cost more to where things cost less. More space, but also a shift in mindset. If I live in Texas, I live somewhere warm. Am I chasing warmth and like that weather the same way I might have before? If I move to South Florida, do I need the beach the way I did before? Am I now thinking about places like Montana and Idaho where I might not have before? If I'm in the places like, I don't know, the Florida Panhandle, where am I pulling from and what does the places that I'm close to mean? There's another element here that's very, very practical. If people moved, a lot of our perceptions of where we should be marketing to and what message are going to resonate within those specific areas we're going to be marketing have changed. And one of the most fascinating things we were looking at in a lot of cases, whether it was in retail, it was in tourism, it was in hospitality, we had a lot of people saying, well, looking for reasons why certain groups were moving to different areas of the country. And it could be, I'm not talking about audience, I'm talking about like dining chains, restaurants, hotel groups, retailers. And the reason they were moving was not because there was some issue with where they were, it's because their audience moved. And when your audience moves, two things are happening. One, I need to refocus or recalibrate the way I market. But two, I need to ask if the same things that were a draw before are still a draw. And so these shifts in our day-to-day patterns fundamentally change the way we view tourism, the way we view where we want to travel, the way we view what that travel means, what the escape factor is. Again, I love the beach, but if I live on the beach, does the beach become my vacation or am I looking for something else now? And so I think understanding those shifts can have a huge impact on the way we look for where our audiences are, look for the audiences that might be a fit for us now, and try to understand why are we seeing changes in our day to day and what could be those causes of those shifts.
What can travel and tourism professionals learn from retail behavior in late 2024? Like, what does it tell us about retail's role in the tourism industry?
Yeah, I mean, I love this. This is one of my favorite graphs slash it's kind of like two findings together that we saw from late 2024. What's interesting here is if you operate within the or if you're away, I think we've all shopped, right? Let's think that we're all consumers of retail. If you've ever been to a mall before, you know there's this thing called an anchor tenant. Those anchor tenants are major department stores often, those major department stores. What was fascinating, and the thing that we saw over the pandemic, was malls were doing very, very well. And in many cases, the visitation to the malls was outpacing the visitation to the anchor tenants within those same malls. So, meaning consumers were coming to the mall for almost everything but the anchor tenant. Really, really interesting. The other thing we were seeing was that people were willing to go further during periods where they had time off to go to malls, right? And there's two things that we've seen, and more so than they were in the past, too. Like, so a greater difference. And one of the things that we identified was a real shift in what was taking place in retail spaces. And this gives us a really good indication of where tourism needs to head as well, right? Think about retail spaces. We think about that our perception of the mall from like 19, from 19, at least for me, I can say that. But like, let's say 2005, let's make it a little bit easier. We have this image of the mall that's still this like 80s-esque perspective of like someone walking around with like 18 different bags in the crook of their arm for this like full-on shopping experience. Yet, when we look at what's going on in top tier malls across the country, we're seeing a decline in the amount of space dedicated to apparel and beauty retail, which was the dominant part of malls in that period. And we're seeing an increase in square footage oriented towards high-end dining, oriented towards experiences, and this big other category, whether it's fitness chains, medical chains, whatever it may be. And what's happening is malls are becoming more diverse, less oriented towards just apparel, because they want to create this holistic experience that keeps someone somewhere longer, someone somewhere longer. When we think about downtown areas, something very similar is happening, right? People want to go when they can grab a great bite to eat, do a little bit of shopping. Oh, there's an escape room or something cool going on, right? That we can like, take advantage of. There's some sort of like night activity, there's nightlife element there that's a draw. There's walking areas, there's markets, these things but I don't just want one, I want it all together. And I want it to all be unique. I want it to all be either high end or depending on what I'm looking for. And this idea that people are willing to travel further, they're willing to work their way around what should be the anchor tells us so much about the consumer mindset of I want this holistic experience. And emphasizing the ability to check those boxes is such a key part to creating that draw today.
How can regions better understand and adapt to seasonal patterns in tourism?
So this is interesting. I think that there is a clear challenge when we look at, seasonality. And I don't think I'm saying anything that is so shocking here, but certain cities see certain traffic during certain periods of the year. So again, Miami is always going to see this winter boost because people are cold in New York and they want to travel there. But most places that we have talked to, and again, this could be smaller towns, this could be large cities, they know their seasonal trends. The real question is, what do I do to lift my peaks and reduce my valleys? So, what can I do in a time so that when you visit my city, when you're not really, well, I'm not seeing my peak, I can create these elements that drive it. And the thing that always pops into my mind is, and when I think about seasonality, it just shows my own weirdness, but is the tie-dye frappuccino. For those of you who don't remember, as I think many of you probably don't, Starbucks once a year launched a tie-dye frappuccino. It was not a massive success. It wasn't like, oh my God, everyone's now building their annual calendars around this. But what was interesting was they launched it on a week that the year before had been their worst week of the entire year. And they saw year-over-year growth that week. Again, game changer for the brand forever? No. Lift on a previous valley? Yes. And these are the things that we're seeing more cities, more tourism organizations trying to understand. How do I create a draw when otherwise there might not be? So if I'm a ski town, what is the pull to come during the summer? If I'm more oriented towards come during the hot weather, what do I have? What fares? What can I do to take advantage of maybe a milder climate? And the real emphasis on investing in what is it that I could possibly offer? And then where do the audiences exist that could be in line for wanting to have something like that? And the cool thing is, it's not just about what could work in my area. It's looking for comps, right? So I'm an area, I see that, I don't know, Southern California does this really awesome thing, and I want to copy it in my beach town in South Carolina. What can I do to try and make that happen? I can look at the elements that worked and then see which audiences pulled for it. And can I target those audiences? Is there some of those people who might be willing to travel my way? And so there's a way to come up with these concepts that are even more creative, but bake them in data in such a way that it raises the floor on what how successful I can be with it and raises my ceiling at the same time.
So, what could be done to better support assets like museums or other attractions?
So I think like one of the things is like obviously there's always these big moves. There's certain things that are just going to drive crowds and drive a lot of attention. But I think even small areas of focus is a big piece. Like there is this thing of people are constantly looking for that thing to do nearby. I think we undervalue our localist audiences, so that kind of degree of separation or two away. And what can we get them to do to come to museums, downtown areas? What can we create that's not all that expensive, doesn't require this massive investment, but can still create that. I think a lot of it is also how do we support like the local organizations that are part and parcel of the fabric of tourism in these areas and use them as the standout, the star that's going to draw that audience. Because once you're there, you're looking to do multiple things. And I think that value is really significant.
What roles do like events and festivals have on driving tourism?
I mean, this isn't going to be as shocking for your audience as maybe it was for me, but we were talking to a city that had this whole run of events over the course of a year, and you saw how significant those peaks were when these events took place, and how much of an audience they were able to draw. And what was really interesting is one of the most interesting ways we will look at value is whether the we'll look at the true trade area. So the true trade area will look at where is the audience that someone's pulling in from. And it's not just a radial ring, it'll show it in all its weirdly shaped amorphous glory. And the really interesting thing is not just the visit jumps. It's when we look at the period after, does the trade area go back to what it was or does it increase? So I might look at a year where I saw a huge trade area increase because I don't know, I hosted the Super Bowl. I'm not expecting to have the same pull the next year because I'm not hosting the Super Bowl 2 years in a row. But do I see some retention? So I've exposed myself to these new audiences and now they're excited and they're part of them are coming back. And that's what we want to see with things like this. We want to see the utilization of events that can bring us those different types of peaks, potentially augment the strengths or reduce those valleys. But then we also want to understand what did it really drive and which ones actually expanded my long-term reach, because those are the ones that are extra valuable because they're producing ongoing, it's almost like a loyalty program. They're producing ongoing value.
How can tourism better align with local businesses? Like, what is the ideal balance between like leveraging larger chains or supporting more independent businesses?
So I'm big and again, it should line up with what we were saying before. If authenticity and brand and having something unique to bring to the table are more significant than they were before, then we want to double down on the things that create that sense of authenticity. I love Starbucks. I love Dunkin'. I've never walked into one and be like, oh my God, this is so authentic to the city I'm in right now, right? It's a massive chain. It's not. That doesn't mean it's not great, but it doesn't scream authenticity. Other places absolutely do that. And so the emphasis on those small independents, on the mom and pop shops, especially the ones that really resonate with what is the identity of that area, local food, local, I mean, look, I'm a lover of the pastries. So like if you have something that is like special in your area, I'm all in. Those things really move the needle and they create the vibe and experience that makes people want more. And again, it really resonates from a word of mouth perspective. It really resonates from a how do you tell the story in imagery? Like these places have a powerful element. And so I think sometimes we're looking for the big because the big provides these benefits, but actually we have to figure out how to better emphasize the small, and the cities that are able to do it, the areas that are able to do that are able to come far ahead, especially when we consider how significant that brand awareness, that brand authenticity piece is.
How is the balance changing in terms of vacation duration, and what does that mean for tourism?
So what's interesting is certain areas are seeing increase in the visit duration and certain are seeing shrinking, right? And what's like fascinating is when we think about duration, there's how far is someone coming from? That's going to impact visit duration. The level amount of things I have to do that's obviously going to they're going to impact visit duration. And the more we want to think about that, that key is how do we create, especially in scenarios, how do I understand how to toggle what I'm looking for depending on what the wider environment is telling me? So, for example, we're in a period where there's some economic concerns. In that environment, am I making sure that I am ready and prepared to really target that local community, that degree of separation or two away, so that the cost of visiting is much lower? Because even if it's a shorter visit, it might be worthwhile because the longer visit might be a challenge at the moment because of the economic situation. So I want to understand what are the differences in behaviors? What are the differences in patterns? Who am I competing with for each visit? Because for example, if I'm, Los Angeles, I'm probably competing with New York and Miami and Chicago, all these cities too. I'm also competing with local. When I'm thinking local, it's there's other areas that are that some of my audiences will go across the country for, and some that I'm really competing with other cities in my region. And understanding those different competitive balances can give us a great indication of what are the tactics that really move the needle for those audiences so that when we're in a situation where we need more from one or the other, we can better leverage them.
What can we learn from the success that has driven by major draws entering the new market?
So just a couple of things here that I think are really interesting. One is, I don't think this is going to be such a crazy statement, but having a pro sports team is like really helpful. It's a draw. The interesting thing is not only is it a draw, but it's a changing draw. So one of my favorite things that we saw is the expansion of the Detroit Lions true trade area as their record got better over the last few seasons, right? I did not know I was going to be talking to a Detroit native in this call. Happy to give the flowers where flowers are deserved. But that it was insane how far it was coming. Other types of analysis we've done are the types, the caliber of visits that come regular season versus postseason. We did an analysis once with the Golden State Warriors when they were playing in the playoffs versus when they were playing in the regular season. And when they were playing in the playoffs, their household income went up massively. So their most ardent fans weren't coming. The ones who would come to all the games throughout the season weren't the ones showing up for the playoffs. Those are the ones who had the money to afford the tickets. Whereas when we looked at that series was against the Portland Trailblazers, we looked at the same Portland arena. We saw almost no difference between the regular season and the postseason. That tells us so much about who the consumer is. Now, what's interesting here is who the consumer, who the audience is. Now, obviously, this applies to the pro level. It also applies to the college level to a large extent. But it also applies when we think about the cities, how many cities that we've met who are really oriented towards like team sport travel. We have this great park where there's lots of baseball fields or this great place where people play volleyball. Do I understand what are the differences in those patterns? Do I understand who it's attracting in and what I'm building around to make that experience a little bit longer? Place there, they want to spend one more night or they come in a night early because they love what they're seeing around or what there is to do. Recognizing that any type, now sports is a great example, but there's so many others, any institution that you get to build around is an advantage. And understanding how do you take that as the starting point, but then create this holistic thing around it is really critical to maximizing the impact.
And then what impact could widespread tariffs have on consumer behavior more broadly and tourism specifically?
So I like to pretend that I have a crystal ball. I don't actually have one, but I think what's interesting, and we were having this conversation in the office today, um, the tariff situation is kind of new, and there's unique elements to it that make it difficult to do a direct comparison with some of the things we've experienced in the last few years. With that said, we have experienced a lot of economic volatility in the last few years. And if there's one thing that we've learned from economic volatility in the past few years, it's that one, consumers are extra impacted by value. So if I am leading a marketing organization for a tourism group, I am trying to emphasize the fact that you can have an amazing trip and that trip doesn't have to cost you so much. The other thing we have seen is that there is clearly a correlation between domestic tourism and economic volatility in the sense that there are clearly audiences that are pushed out, but maybe they're doing day trips. There are audiences that would have wanted to travel to Italy, but now they can't afford it, or they're nervous about the economic situation, so they want to travel local. And there are those who are going to, who are just unimpacted. The unimpacted, okay, nothing's changed. This is your standard marketing strategy. But for recognizing that there's shifts within those other two segments, and again, those are way too generalized, but you'll see those differences across the country in different ways and in more nuance with more layers. There is a powerful opportunity if I know how to draw them in, if I know how to communicate that message of why my town provides all the excitement, all the energy at a significant discount, especially now. That being able to speak to the consumer where they're at is so powerful. And again, we think about authenticity, it's authenticity of a place, it's authenticity of the message. Those are the things that we see that are really resonating. And with that, we can go to any questions that people might have.
I did see that someone had their hand raised, and I was trying to look through. I don't see it up anymore. So if that person still has their question, please, I apologize, I missed it, but please raise your hand again or ask it in the chat.
I think we lost them.
I'm sure you answered it in the meantime.
Amazing.
Well, we can continue on. If anybody has any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. Oh, I do. Um, there is one question. Any data available on past FIFA events?
Okay. You are touching on a sweet spot for us. We have done a lot of this. Okay, so we don't obviously, because the nature of our data begins in Jan 1, 2017. The best things we are looking at is obviously, because the World Cup is coming up, there's a lot of excitement and energy around what that could mean. Um, if you look at, I'll tell you the best things to look at. Look at the impact of Messi in Miami, what he does when he travels and the amount of energy it generates when he goes to a different city. Look at when you can look at when foreign teams will come and play exhibitions in the US. Now, the one challenge is it's usually in major cities. So it's a little bit limited in what you in the scope. And those major cities generally have an audience that they expect to be connected to soccer more. But you do see these same phenomena as we talked about in other sports, where this massive increase of the trade area, this willingness of people with higher income to go and attend and be a part of it because it's a draw, it's something exciting. And I think that's something you're going to see very aggressively. We're really looking forward. We're digging into the same data, trying to get a sense of like what we can expect from place to place around the country. But I would say our early expectation is that it's going to have a very significant impact on those areas that are directly impacted.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ethan. Again, if anyone has any other questions, drop them in while we're still here. If not, you're more than welcome to reach out at any time. If you contact the admin at ttra.com email, I'll make sure that your questions get sent to Ethan or contacted in some sort of way. So thank you everyone for attending our call today. I will be sending out the links to access the recording in the next coming days. We do have someone asking if they could get the slides for today's webinar.
Sure. Happily.
Then we'll work on getting those sent out as well. And again, if you have any other further questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you again, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
So